Hi guys and welcome to my review of the new Catfish and the Bottlemen album, The Ride. Catfish and the Bottlemen are an alternative rock band from Wales who had their first album, The Balcony, back in 2014, which I was actually really late to. In fact, I only listened to it for the first time a few weeks ago. Like, for a long time, I think I heard one of their songs like a year ago and wasn't a huge fan of it. And I kept trying them again and again, and I just wasn't getting into them for some reason. And then, a while ago, I had one of their songs stuck in my head, so I sat down, listened to the album, and I actually really liked it. The band have a really good mix of having these really huge anthemic songs that, you know, you expect to hear at a festival where everyone like shouts out the lyrics, but also the guitar work is very almost like post-punk revival-esque. It kind of like has that very bright, crunchy, and like clean yet aggressive at the same time sound that bands like Arctic Monkeys and the Wombats had. And although the album was not perfect, it had some really solid tracks on it. For me, especially Homesick, the opening track on the album, Kathleen, Cocoon, and Tyrants, their final track. So this is their follow-up album, which a lot of the album is written about kind of their experiences on tour. Not as much about, you know, everything that's been going on while they've been on tour, but more about sort of the things they miss, mainly the girls they miss. For example, the opening track on the album, 7, which is a song written about being 7 hours away from the girl that he loves. I really like the progression in this track, how it starts off almost subdued and then blasts into this acoustic section. It wasn't what I expected, actually. And this is easily one of the more different tracks on this album. I feel like the album as a whole, for the most part, it does play things a bit too safe, but there are a few tracks where they try something new, which sometimes work, which in the case of this track it does and sometimes don't, but we'll get into that later on. The melody on this track is really catchy. In fact, I had it stuck in my head for a long time after listening to it. And the track is definitely one of the more emotional tracks on the album. In fact, a lot of the album is quite emotional, which may kind of seem a little bit boring at times. The album isn't as explosive as the first album, it's much more emotional, but this is one of the tracks where the emotions actually really work. I think it's kind of an odd track to open the album with. Like, I think the main single, Soundcheck, maybe would have been a better opener, but it was still a really good track, and definitely for me one of the highlights of the album. Next up we have the song Twice, another one of my highlights and definitely one of the largest and most aggressive tracks on the album too. It's lyrically about looking back on past mistakes and realizing that they can't go back to them. For me, the chorus of this track is incredibly powerful, especially at the beginning where he screams out Christ. I just love the chorus on this track. And the melody all across the song is fantastic, especially in the chorus. I found it incredibly catchy. Like, this is like easily one of the most memorable and catchy songs on the album for me. Like, I don't know, I've just had it stuck in my head ever since I first heard the single, and I don't know, out of all the tracks, I think this is one of the ones that really stuck out to me, and I really feel like I can listen to over and over again and not get bored of, which the first album had many tracks like that, but this album not so much. And I also love how they have a slower chorus towards the end of the track. For me, that just really worked. And next up we have the first and probably main single for the album, Soundcheck, which is easily for me the highlight of the album and up there with some of the best tracks this band have ever written. It's about the lead singer meeting a girl that he loves so much that he's willing to put everything in his life aside for just for her. He's had like huge ambitions of the things he wants, but he realizes when he's got her, he doesn't need any of that, he just needs her. The softer pre-chorus in the track is really catchy, and I've had it stuck in my head ever since the single came out. And the chorus is the classic huge sing-along anthemic sound that you expect from the band's choruses, like very similar to things like Kathleen on their first album. I feel like this song actually perfectly encapsulates everything that makes this band good into one song, but at the same time it kind of shows a lot of progression from their first album, and it's definitely quite different from the first album. And I feel like if every single track on the album was like this could have been a fucking great album, maybe even way better than the first one. And the instrumentation on this track is just amazing. Like, there's a guitar solo in it, which isn't like super flashy or anything, and is definitely one of the simpler guitar solos they've done, but it just sounds huge and loud and epic. Next up, we have the song Postpone. This song shows a lot of Oasis influence, which they do show a lot throughout the album. In some songs, maybe a tiny bit too much. In fact, there's a couple of tracks, which I'll get to, that basically just sound like Oasis. I love the triplets that are played on the guitar in the chorus. For me, that just really stood out. Although this track isn't really memorable or standout or anything, it doesn't have the staying power that the first few tracks on the album have, and I definitely don't see myself going back and listening to this track loads of times. And next up is another highlight for me, the song Anything, which is a song about the strain that touring has put on his relationship. He sings about the sacrifices that he'd make for this girl who he loves so much. Like, he says if she stopped smoking, he would do that too. And the melody in this track, especially in the chorus, is really, really memorable, and it definitely makes it one of the more memorable tracks on the album. And there's also this really, really good wah-wah covered solo, which I absolutely love. It's definitely one of the best solos on this album. And next up we have Glasgow, which is definitely one of the more different tracks on the album. A lot of people found this track really repetitive, mainly because for the most part it's just one simple guitar riff played on acoustic guitar throughout, but I personally really like this track. I definitely think this is, for me, one of my favourite tracks on the album, and I think it's a sign that they really can do other stuff than just the normal anthemic sound that we know from them. And going back to the Oasis influence from earlier, we have the song Oxygen, which literally just sounds like very like sort of the heavier side of What's the Story Morning Glory from Oasis. In fact, for me, this track just shows way too much of an influence, and it just doesn't sound like Catfish and the Bottlemen. It sounds like they're trying to be a completely different band than they actually are. The track really is not that bad, but for me it's just way too derivative, and I just could not get into it. But the album does pick up massively with the song Red, which instrumentally is one of the best sounding tracks on the whole album. The production work on this track is fucking fantastic. In fact, the production work on the whole album is really, really good. But for me, some of the best is on this track especially. Although he does repeat the line, "Can he do what I do for you?" which does get incredibly repetitive when he says it over and over again. And then we have Heathrow, which, again, sounds like Oasis. It sounds like sort of the slower acoustic stuff like Wonderwall, that sort of thing. It literally does not sound like Catfish and the Bottlemen at all, and I did not like this track at all. And now we get to the final track on the album, Outside. The Balcony had a fantastic final track with Tyrant. Like, I thought it did a fantastic job of kind of being very slow and emotional throughout the song, and towards the end it really builds up and it keeps building up and building up, and then just completely cuts out the song and it's midway through. I thought the way they built it up was fantastic, and this track tries to do the same, but it ends way too abruptly. Like, it ends just as it sounds like it's about to build up to something. So the song kind of doesn't really go anywhere, and although the solo at the end is really solid, the song just kind of ends, and yeah, literally it just cuts out to silence halfway through a random like bar, and it doesn't work on this track because it just seems so abrupt. There's no build up to anything, so it literally sounds like they've just cut halfway through the song for no reason whatsoever. Although the track does sound very big, and I do enjoy a lot of it, it just doesn't have that really great final feeling to the album that Tyrants had. As a whole, I have many big problems with the ride. I think there are some really solid tracks, especially the first 3 or 4 tracks on the album, but for me, it either seems like they're trying to play it safe or they're trying to be a completely different band. There are tracks on here where I'm just listening to it and thinking this could have easily been on The Balcony. This like sort of sounds like an outtake from that album, and then there's other times where they're sounding like they're trying to become a different band, and those moments don't work. Where I think the album's at its best is when they're actually trying new things without trying to be someone else. Songs like Soundcheck, it's very much the classic Catfish and the Bottlemen sound, but there's a lot of progression, a lot more maturity on this track, and it sounds so much better than a lot of the previous album. It's just a real shame that the rest of the album didn't sound like that song, because this album would have been fucking great if it all sounded like that. Soundcheck, in my opinion, is easily one of my favourite tracks from this year so far, so it's a real shame that the rest of the album just doesn't stand out as much as that one track. But honestly, it's not terrible. I would definitely recommend it if you were a fan of the first album and if you're a fan of the band. I just don't think this album is as good as it possibly could be. The first album showed so much potential for the band, and a lot of people were thinking that their follow-up album could have been better than that. Like, sort of, they've been on tour now, they've seen how everyone reacts to the songs on their first album, so you think they'd learn from that, learn what people love, and bring that into the new album, which they kind of do at times, but I don't know, I don't feel like the songs on this album are going to translate as well over to the live setting as the first album did. Overall, The Ride by Catfish and the Bottlemen is not terrible, but it lacks so much. It has a few fantastic songs, but for the most part, it does kind of just feel like filler, and I was really disappointed by it. I'm going to give The Ride by Catfish and the Bottlemen a 7 out of 10. Did you listen to The Ride? If so, what did you think of it? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Put it in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.